When you're looking at modern TCGs and really TCGs from across the age of of trading card games, there are a couple of key distinctions that designers have used to make their games stand out. And those, I think, in my mind, are the two biggest ones are the resource systems of their game and the victory conditions of their games. Uh, I'm going to today go through a bunch of resource systems from a bunch of different games. And I know the title is going to tell you that I'm going to tell you which one's the best. I will tell you which one is my favorite, but I will be really honest with you. I think the best one is a little bit conditional for what you want out of your experience. And I'm going to also explain what the various resource systems give you as a player and why designers have probably leaned towards those as a design choice. I do have my preferences, ones that I think are better, ones that I think make for more enjoyable gameplay, but that's not to discredit the other ones or to suggest that they are in some way worse, because there are a variety of different reasons why you might want to use different resource systems. And so I don't want to downplay anything if it is something that you prefer. I think that there are pluses and minuses to all of them. So to start with, I think we're going to start with the one that makes the most sense to start with, which is Magic the Gathering, the progenitor of resource systems. You're going to find Magic's fingerprints in a lot of these systems that I'm going to talk about today. Obviously, when you're building a card game with numbers and you're trying to gate effects in a way that so that not every deck gets to play all of the best cards. Lands that make colored mana in this case are often going to be things that people are going to reach towards. But let's talk about Magic's system and how it works and what the pros and cons of it are. So Magic's system is obviously the mana system. You have lands and other cards, but mostly lands. These are cards that go in your 60 card deck. You can play one land a turn. Lands usually tap for one mana of some color. Sometimes they tap for two different colors. And then your cards have typically generic mana costs and then also a colored mana cost associated with them as well. So what are the positives of the mana system? Well, the first one is that with 5 colors, you have the ability to create a pretty kind of interesting subset of cards that use the color pie system. The color pie is something that I've talked about before on the channel, but it's really powerful because it allows designers to make choices around cards that are powerful without worrying about every deck immediately just playing as many of them as possible. And so the mana system is good in that regard, in just that it supports the color pie's existence. The mana system is also, I think, pretty interesting because it adds additional deck building decisions for players, which is also something that is oftentimes undersold. One of the really fun things about trading card games is, in general, can be when you get to the tuning portion of deck construction where you're arguing over like one or two flex slots left in a deck to try and really hammer out exactly what the optimal build might look like. And with the mana system, those slots also end up being like, are we going to play the 23rd land? Are we going to play the 24th land? Which can be pretty interesting. And I think certainly a source of both like design, a chance for designers to kind of like make interesting choices, but also a chance for players to make interesting play choices. Additionally, in an environment like draft, it really colors how you have to approach draft environments. Depending on the quality of the mana in the draft environment, it allows designers to gate powerful draft cards behind higher colored mana requirements, and that will inherently kind of like force players to make choices that respect that. So for example, like there have been plenty of draft environments where double and triple pip cards have been a relatively large part of the format. And the nice thing about that is that you're allowed to make those cards pretty powerful, with the notion being, well, we know that players are not really going to be able to play both like Shore Crasher Elemental and then some other really powerful double white or double blue card or double red card because they can't support that mana in their draft deck or even in their constructed deck. The Theros block constructed had a lot of monocolored decks, which was very cool. Lastly, I think it's important to note with the mana system that there are a lot of different interpretations of it across the eras of Magic. And I think that earlier on in Magic's kind of history, you had basic lands, and then you just had the Alpha Beta Unlimited dual lands, which just tap for two different colors. They were largely just upgrades on basic lands. Uh, and over the years, that's improved. And I do think now, with the way that mana bases are constructed in any format that is not like standard or pioneer, so basically any format that has fetch lands, uh, that we're actually almost losing some of the elements that I think are really interesting about the mana system, where you have to make concerted choices about how to construct your mana base to support playing consistently and support playing like the most powerful cards with respecting their pips. The the fetch land system allows players to be pretty greedy with at least the first two colors in their deck, and really the third color is oftentimes pretty splashable as well. Fetch lands are just lands that for a life point can sacrifice to go find a land of one of two basic land types, and importantly both the Alpha Beta Unlimited dual lands and then also the Ravnica shock lands are multiple land types. And so what that can mean is that your like Verdant Catacombs, which finds a swamp or a forest, can secretly be a 4-color land because it can go find Watery Grave, which is an island and a swamp, and it can find Stomping Ground, which is a forest and a mountain. So this one land all of a sudden becomes able to represent 4 different colors. And obviously there are still deck building decisions to be made around these fetch dual land mana bases, but to me, they're less interesting, and that they have started to take away from some of the positives of what you would get out of the mana, what you get out of the mana system. And even in standard too, they're increasingly printing more and more dual lands in every set, to the point where supporting 3-color strategies in standard has become increasingly plausible. And to me, that's something that I like sometimes, but I don't want it to be something that's always possible. And I think that right now it's kind of more 2-color strategies, to be fair. But historically, in the last kind of 5-10 years, there have been issues around 3 and 4-color decks being overly playable in these formats, which has really degraded some of the positives that you get out of the mana system. Let's talk about some of the negatives of the mana system, because there are some. One of them is that this system is by far the most punishing from a variance standpoint, because the major sources of mana are lands that go into your deck. You can just not draw enough lands, or you can only draw lands and not be able to play the game because you don't have any spells. Mana Screw and Mana Flood are how are referred to in the game, obviously, and those experiences are exceptionally negative. Obviously, if you ask any Magic player, this is going to be something that they're going to point to as a major pain point. And there really isn't some like magical way to, no pun intended, there is no magical way to explain away these problems, other than you have to argue that the good outweighs the bad, that all of the pros of the mana system make the occasional negative play experience worth it. There is something to be said, I guess, that like you can mitigate those negative play experiences in the deck construction process, right? So if you have been finding that you never draw enough red mana in your draft deck, but you're playing like 10 islands and 5 mountains, it's like, okay, well, you kind of did that to yourself. That's theoretically something that you could have made decisions about to not have happen. But that being said, there are plenty of games where your deck is constructed pretty close to optimally. You have a nice balance of colored sources, you have the right number of lands in your deck, you have a curve that respects that fact that you're only playing 22 lands or whatever, and you just still draw 7 lands in a row, and you lose the game and you feel like you didn't get to play. So that's the real pain point of the Magic system. So what are the pros and cons of Magic's system, and what does it really allow for overall? I think the pros are it's this extremely flexible system both for designers and players, and ultimately that is why people grasp onto the game so much and why people keep coming back. I think is because there really is just so much you can do with this resource system that is interesting and dynamic, and that has happened for the last 30 years. So that's the big pro, is I think the dynamism of the system is extremely high. The negatives are, because of the structure of the system, the variance is extremely high. And as a result, that negative variance does create some bad gameplay experiences at times. And that is something that you have to kind of reckon with when you're balancing these two things. But overall, for me, I think the good outweighs the bad. And I think that, I think that if you want a gameplay experience where incorporating your resource system very directly into the deck building process is valuable, then you should absolutely be looking at the mana system. I do think it's interesting and worth noting here that of all the other games I'm going to talk about today, almost none of them have attempted to incorporate the magic resource system straight up, where resources are cards that you draw as part of your main deck and play into a zone. Almost every other game came to the conclusion that they wanted to do a different system to this, which I think is interesting and something that is worth unpacking. Clearly, more modern designers are concluding two things. One, that the variance is probably not necessarily worth it in their game. And two, that if you incorporate too similar of a system to Magic, you're just going to be competing with it, and then that's maybe a bit of a fool's errand. But yeah, so that's the Magic resource system. I think it's a pretty sweet one, and it has some definite pros, some definite cons, but obviously the original, and you're going to see inspirations from it throughout this video. Okay, so next we have the Pokemon resource system. I'm going to start with the big three kind of OG trading card games because we're going to see that their bones are really kind of represented throughout many of the modern games that I'm going to then subsequently talk about. So the Pokemon system is a little bit different, obviously, from Magic. There are very different costs in Pokemon versus almost any other game. Notably, Pokemon, you are attaching resources directly to Pokemon. So Pokemon get energy attached to them. They need to have a certain amount of energy on them in order to be able to use their attacks. And the resources do still occupy slots in your deck, so you have to make choices about which resources you're going to play. So that is a comparable one to Magic, but they're very different in the way that those resources are actually manifested in game. Similarly, in Pokemon, it's more plausible to do a fair amount of tutoring to find specific energy, obviously format specific, but in general, the consistency in Pokemon is such that you're relatively capable of getting to your resources at a relatively consistent rate. But similar to Magic, you do still have to make deck building considerations in order to ensure that that is the case. There are also other resource systems in Pokemon besides just energy and how the energy is used. Most notably, we have limits on the number of supporters you can use and things like this, which allow, again, the designers to print powerful effects knowing that they will only be able to be used once per turn and not in concert with other powerful effects on that same turn. So that's obviously another kind of resource, this idea of a hard once per turn for a specific card type, which, again, pretty interesting, allows for some dynamic decisions. The positives, I think, for the Pokemon system are, once again, it rewards deck building decisions. It allows for the designers to theoretically use like mixed energy costs or expensive energy costs to put pretty like reasonable deck building constraints on playing certain powerful effects, which is obviously quite good. I think the cons with the energy system, and I haven't played that much Pokemon, so bear with me on this one. I think for me, one of the big cons of the Pokemon energy system is that it can at times feel a bit confusing, I think, to explain and to grasp. Essentially, if you end up in the situation where you attach energy wrong in a Pokemon game, I think that it can feel like this cascading mistake that makes most of the game subsequently feel somewhat frustrating. And when you have games where your resources just go into a generic pool, even if you spend your resources wrong on a turn, it doesn't have that same kind of cascading negative impact as attaching the energy to the wrong Pokemon. I think that this is honestly like kind of a nitpick if I'm being really realistic, right? Like this is not some like horrific design problem that means that Pokemon's resource system should be invalidated. But it's the biggest one that I encountered as a pain point. And then obviously, because these are resources that are part of your deck, you can encounter the same kind of resource variance that you would experience in Magic. I think that in Pokemon, the velocity of the decks and the number of cards the decks see and the amount of searching in the average deck is high enough that you don't experience quite the same level of negative energy variance as you might see with Mana Screw and Mana Flood, but obviously still a present issue in that system as well. But overall, a very interesting system, another one of the kind of like original attempts. You don't see a ton of games trying to use this same system that I've played, at least ones where you're attaching resources directly. They do exist, certainly, but Pokemon's resource system has stayed pretty unique, I think, over the years for the most part. I have a couple of games that definitely reference it pretty directly, but in general, it's one of the ones that has had fewer imitators. And I think in part, again, that's because, imitation risks comparison. And I think that that's not the road that many designers wanted to go down. Okay, so next we have the Yu-Gi-Oh! Resource system. I've made a couple of videos over the last couple of months about various aspects of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Resource system that I find interesting. And Yu-Gi-Oh!'s resource system is the most complicated to explain in the sense that there are a couple of resource elements that are generic, and then there are also a couple of resource elements that are going to be archetype specific to a particular archetype. Let's talk about the generic resource constraints in Yu-Gi-Oh! First, and then we can talk about some of the more specific ones. So generically, there are a couple. One, the biggest one that I think you can point to is the normal summon. So this is something you just get to do it once a turn, and once you have done it, there are some ways to get a second one, but in general, like you get one a turn and then theoretically no other ones. And so that's the one like really big key resource that you can point to as someone spending on their turn. You can see them spending their normal summon, and you can know pretty generically that regardless of what their archetype is doing, that normal summon is important and valuable, and now they are likely constrained from doing most other things, or many other things that would require a normal. Secondly, there's this resource of cards in hand. A bit of a weird one to define, but essentially like a lot of elements of Yu-Gi-Oh! Require you to have multiple cards in hand. Frequently when you're doing things like special summoning like Synchro or Fusion monsters, you do have to have multiple monsters either on the battlefield or in hand. And so as a result, the number of cards that you have in hand is oftentimes a relevant resource to track because it can determine what plays you're eligible to make. Lastly, the last generic resource, and this one's a little bit weirder to describe, but it's the extra deck and space in extra deck. So one of the things that theoretically gates players from just jamming together a bunch of strategies is the amount of extra deck slots that those strategies require. So a good example of this is like an archetype like Fiendsmith, for example, is oftentimes very splashable because it only requires like 6 extra deck slots. An archetype like Mitsurugi, one of the big reasons why it felt so splashable and frustrating is it required 0 extra deck slots, which meant you could just put main deck cards in your deck, and for the cost of 0 extra deck spots, you could have this archetype in your deck. So extra deck slots are relevant because they are oftentimes where you're going to have core combo pieces, things that are important in your combo line to get to your M board. And so theoretically, well, not theoretically, it is just a general truth that you only get 15 of those. And so you can't just play every combo because you won't be able to fit all of the cards in your extra deck. So those are the generic ones. There are probably a couple other things that you could define as generic. I would hear arguments for them. But then there are a bunch of card and archetype specific resources as well that you kind of have to know what's going on in order to be able to engage with. And these are what I would describe as kind of just like hard once per turn effects or just once per turn effects. And without knowing exactly what each of these are in the deck that you're playing or playing against, it can be a little bit harder to qualify exactly what these are. But a good example of this would be something like I'll use an example from one that I've played a decent amount of. So like Fire Formation Tenki, for example, which I play in Lunalight, is only activatable once a turn. It just searches for a Fire Warrior once per turn, and that can then subsequently turn into more of your combo. And so in that deck, that resource is only usable one time. So you, as the opponent, once that comes out, know that at no other stage in this turn is there going to be a Tenki activated. There's not going to be another monster added to my hand. And then additionally, and this is where it gets really kind of wonky, you could also know, both as the player playing the deck and as the player playing against the deck, that, oh god, I've forgotten the name, but the extra deck monster that Lunalight often plays that overlays for 2/4s, that searches a fire formation, Fire King something, I think. No. Anyway, that card is also turned off. You know that 2/4s, which in Lunalight can often equal any Fire Warrior, doesn't anymore because Tenki is turned off. That is a deck specific and archetype specific hard once per turn. And there are an innumerable number of those in Yu-Gi-Oh, right? Those kinds of effects can be seen as both proactive ones like Tenki, which is going to search and tutor and allow you to advance your combo, but it can also be seen reactively. There are lots of cards that are able to activate their effect to negate a spell trap or destroy something, but it's on a once per turn. And so a lot of the time, the resource system of Yu-Gi-Oh is specific to the archetype that you're playing against, and it's also oftentimes pretty face up. I have this kind of theory, and it's an interesting one, about hand traps, where I think part of the reason why there is this level of frustration about hand traps from the average Yu-Gi-Oh player, or not the average Yu-Gi-Oh player, but for some Yu-Gi-Oh players, is that if you are going second, there's almost this expectation that you should just only be playing into whatever your opponent's end board is. And so when your opponent has the interaction on their end board plus stuff in hand, that feels quite frustrating because it can be hard to calculate exactly what your opponent's resources are. And when your opponent has already had the advantage of going first and building their end board, that feels particularly frustrating. And I think that's why you're seeing them lean towards more and more hand traps that are only usable as the going second player and not as the going first player, because it allows for more of these gameplay states where, as the going first player, you do your thing, and then your interaction, your resources that you have access to on your opponent's turn are a little bit more face up, which is, I think, pretty interesting. So what are the positives of the Yu-Gi-Oh system? I think one of the big things is that the Yu-Gi-Oh system is exceptionally freeform. There are really an innumerable number of things that you can do because it's one of the games that has the fewest restraints, notably because the game is not constrained by numbers to the same extent that most other games are. You don't run into this problem of one being double two, which is kind of a weird way of saying this, but when the smallest number in your game is one and players start at one resource, like in Magic, Pokemon, or any number of other games, that automatically puts the pressure on you to somehow find a way to appropriately scale up power from 1 cost cards, 2 cost cards, 3 cost cards. And that can be very challenging. And historically, when you miss on cards, you are often missing on cards that cost 1 or 2 because they're doing too much for their cost. And in Yu-Gi-Oh's case, they don't have to worry about numbers being the thing that defines whether or not a card does too much. Instead, it has to do with, does this card appropriately lock you out of doing other things? Does this card have the appropriate once per turns on it to only be usable in one particular spot? Is this card in the correct archetype? Is it typed the right way to be not searchable? Those are the kinds of constraints that Yu-Gi-Oh designers have to think about, and they don't necessarily have to think about the same kinds of things. So that kind of freeform element of Yu-Gi-Oh's resource system, I think, is a really big positive, both for designers and also for players. Again, like, I think one of the main reasons why people come back to the game over and over again is because this system allows you to do such interesting things. It allows you to make very cool deck building choices in terms of like finding unique bridges in the extra deck where you can chain one archetype into another. Obviously, when that becomes too trivial and easy, it can become overpowered. So it's not as though that's some perfect thing, but it is an interesting element of the resource system. And additionally, there are some things that you can still point back to be grounded in the normal summon, especially. I think that in recent years, and I'm saying I think because I've only played really modern Yu-Gi-Oh, where basically every archetype has access to a multitude of special summons out of hand or multiple normal summons. So I haven't really played in a world where the best decks were basically like contesting the normal, and if you were able to contest the normal summon, you could potentially win the game. Like, that hasn't really ever been my experience, but I think that that's like one potential downside, is that if you end up in this situation where you only have a normal summon and then like your normal summon gets ashed and you lose the game, that sounds like it's a potentially pretty frustrating gameplay experience. And obviously they've been trying to design around that experience to not have it happen in the same way. So that's one big con. The other big con, I think, of the Yu-Gi-Oh resource system is that it is much harder to approach from a learning standpoint than any other system we're going to talk about today. The Yu-Gi-Oh resource system is explicitly esoteric in a way that no other games is. It can be exceptionally challenging to understand not just how your cards work, but how you get to a point where you can even make those cards work. It's pretty easy to look at an extra deck and see a monster that you have no idea how you meet the summoning condition for it, because there's some trick in the engine that allows you to technically get that monster into play, or the monster will have an alternate summoning condition that is not immediately obvious by just looking at its cost. And I think that that's a real downside, and that's something that from a learning standpoint is why you see a lot of people shy away from learning Yu-Gi-Oh, because when you sit down and you look at a deck list, it is not immediately obvious really what's going on, unless you have a pretty clear kind of level of esoteric knowledge already, or if you've already read a guide. So those are the big downsides, I think, with the Yu-Gi-Oh system, are that just having a normal summon could get frustrating. Obviously they design around that now, but I think that could get frustrating. And additionally, that it is very complex. Okay, we're done with the big three, and I think I managed to keep it under half an hour, which is good. We're gonna spend less time on all the subsequent games, because many of them I'm going to refer to as having their kind of roots in another system, and so I'm not going to have to re-explain the same things over and over again. So now let's go through and talk about some more modern trading card games, some resource system in those, and what the designers, I think, were trying to fix with these resource systems, because most of these systems have reminiscent elements of the original three, but clearly the designers looked at the pain points of those systems and tried to find ways to simplify them and make them feel better and more interesting for users. So, or for players, I should say. So let's start with one of the older ones on this list. This is the Force of Will TCG. I will be very clear because I don't like claiming to be talking about games that I've played if I haven't played them. I haven't played Force of Will, but I've been aware of Force of Will since its printing. And one of the reasons I knew about it is because this is, to my knowledge, one of the first games that created a separate resource deck from the main deck. I know there are other games that have done it as well, but this was the first one that came across my desk in 2013, 2014, I think is when the game came out. And so Force of Will is quite interesting. You have a leader, a J ruler is what it's called, and on your turn, you are able to exhaust or rest your J ruler in order to add an additional resource from your resource deck to your resource row. And then from there, the resources in your resource deck function pretty comparably to lands. To basic lands for Magic. They add one color of resource, and then card costs are pretty comparable to Magic, where they have a color cost and then a generic cost as well. So the Force of Will system is trying to solve a couple of problems at once, right? So firstly, it is trying to solve the negative variance around drawing lands and drawing too many lands or not enough lands by putting them in their own separate deck. So now you still have a deck building decision about how you're going to construct your resource deck. You still have to decide what the distribution of cards is going to be in there, but you don't have the same constraint of worrying about only drawing resources or never drawing resources out of your main deck. Additionally, the way that you play resources is not from hand, but it instead requires you to rest your J ruler, which creates decision points around using that card for its other abilities. If you have another ability on it, or you turn it into a unit that can be attacking or resting to do other things, you are inherently giving up on developing your resources. And as a result, that system then gets to maintain some of these elements of needing to make decisions around how big your deck is going to go, needing to make decisions around what your curve is going to look like. Instead of putting a certain number of lands in your deck, though, to kind of like support the curve that you're playing, you instead need to make decisions around how your J ruler is going to operate and which J ruler you're going to use. But the system clearly does, I think, pretty elegantly solve several of the problems that Magic's mana system presents in a way that, has kept the game alive for 10 plus years. Force of Will is still very played, more popular in Japan than I think it is in North America, but a very popular game. And I think that the Force of Will system that they came up with for the resources is a very interesting one. So that's number one. In that same family, we're going to move to a couple of other Japanese games. This is Gundam and One Piece, which both have similar resource systems. What's going on in these games is a bit different, obviously, than Force of Will. Both Gundam and One Piece have no system for colored resources. So in these games, you choose at most, in Gundam, you choose at most 2 colors, and in One Piece, you choose your colors are based on your leader. In these games, you just get generic resources. So they just come from a resource deck, you put them into play, and you just get them. They don't have a color associated with them, and cards don't have a color associated with them either. Let's talk about One Piece first. So the One Piece system, again, it's using Dawn. These are coming from a Dawn deck. You get to play 2 every turn, except if you are the going first player, in which case you only get 1. So again, this is resolving that issue that we see with Magic, where you can run into negative resource variance. But it is also running afoul of the Magic problem of 1 being half of 2 or 2 being double 1, where you have to work very carefully to make sure that the balance of cards is such that you're not putting too much power in things that cost half as much between the 1 and 2 cost cards. This is a real issue. And then the other thing that I think One Piece has done quite interestingly is that Dawn, or your resource, are not only usable as resources to play cards, they can also be used as what are essentially like combat modifiers on any particular turn. And what this means is that this also attempts to mitigate some of the negative experience of drawing the wrong side of your curve. So in a game like One Piece, where you are always developing resources and then drawing cards from your deck, you're naturally moving up the curve. You can end up in these positions where you end up with a bunch of resources in play, and then you draw a 1 or 2 cost card that you were obligated to put in your deck because you needed to have a curve to play things on the first and second turn of the game. But it feels quite bad to have had, 10 resources in play or 9 resources in play, and you draw a 2-drop and that's all you can play, and your opponent draws a 7-drop and you lose the game. And so Dawn can be attached to units to then give them a temporary power boost, and then they come back to your resource row afterwards. And what this does is it does kind of mitigate this issue. It also allows you to make deck building decisions about, I'm just going to stop playing cards after, say, 4 cost, and any excess Dawn I'm going to just be using as combat modifiers to try to finish the game. And so I really like the One Piece system. I think it's very clever. It solves a bunch of the problems. One of the downsides with the system, and this is something that we're gonna realize in a bunch of these more modern systems, is that because the Dawn themselves don't have color requirements, and because the deck building constraints in One Piece are just play the cards that are legal based on what your leader is, it does create these potential environments, I think, where you put a lot of pressure on designers to not print overpowered cards, and there is no great stopgap for controlling what decks those cards can go in, right? If you just print a very powerful red card, it just goes in every red deck. You can't add more red pips to it to force players to be really only in red to play it, for example. Is something that I would point to as a potential pain point with this system. The other Bandai system that I was talking about in the beginning and that is similar is Gundam. So the Gundam TCG, much newer, it has a similar system where every turn you are adding a resource from a dedicated resource deck. And again, there are not specific colors associated with these resources. They are generic. But your colors are determined ahead of the game, and you can only play up to 2 colors. What I really like about Gundam, and I'm really excited that one of the stores near me is starting to run it, so I'm gonna go to a Learn to Play event soon, which is very exciting because I've been looking at the cards. The game looks super cool. What I really like about the Gundam system is the following: Gundam cards have a cost, and then they also have a level. And these are 2 different things. The level is essentially the number of resources. Well, it's not essentially, it's literally this. It's the number of resources that you need to have in play to be able to pay the cost of this card and play the card. But those 2 numbers are not obligated to be the same. So what you can have is you can have Gundam cards that are level 4 but cost 2, which means that once you get to the 4 resource turn, you can play this card for only 2, allowing you to still do other things and have other interaction or maybe develop a second unit. But it kind of starts to solve this problem of too much power being put on cheaper cards, because it allows you to print cheap cost cards that you can guarantee aren't going to come into play until later turns by putting a higher level on them. Now, obviously, you could still miss on the level and have a level that is too low, and as a result have a card feel oppressive and overpowered. Like, all of these things are subject to choosing the right numbers, but it's very cool, and I think it's very interesting that they've given themselves this second stopgap to ensure that cards don't hit an overpowered state, because you are now allowed to say, well, this is a 3-cost card, but it's level 5. And so we can kind of envision the play patterns around it only coming up once both players have 5 resources in play, as opposed to, okay, this hits play on turn 3. How does it work on turn 3? How does it work on turn 4 with a 1-drop? How does it work on turn 5 with a 2-drop? It allows you to kind of like constrain the amount of interactions that you're envisioning. And I think that is very clever, and I like that system a lot. The one downside with both of these systems, I think, where you are getting a certain number of resources each turn. In Gundam, you get 1 a turn. In One Piece, you get 2 a turn. Is I do think that this hyper consistency can lend itself to homogenization of decks a little bit faster. When you reduce resource variance, you always run the risk of creating situations in which the best decks become more clear more quickly, and also the best decks have fewer opportunities to lose games to variance. And that, I think, can be kind of a negative. I know just anecdotally that recently Gundam was in a somewhat negative metagame state. And I will say nothing more than that because I won't pretend to know more than that. If you know in the comments, tell me more. I'm very curious. But that's certainly something that has happened in Gundam. It's happened in One Piece. It's happened in Star Wars Unlimited, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. And I do think that these kind of hyper consistent resource systems can lend themselves to tier 0 formats a little bit more easily than maybe some other resource systems, because you run into these issues of decks always being able to hit their curve. And if they have this very powerful curve that they are always hitting, you can really run into problems, I think, slightly more frequently. Since I brought it up, let's talk about Star Wars Unlimited. I think that's fine. We might as well move to there. So Star Wars Unlimited's resource system is different from the kind of Force of Will One Piece system because there's not a separate resource stack. But the designers here and Star Wars Unlimited was not the first game to use this system. I'll talk about some of the other ones that have as well. But Star Wars Unlimited's resource system is that any card in your hand can be a resource on your turn. So when you start your turn, you draw 2 cards. You choose a card from your hand to put face down in your resource row as a resource, and it doesn't matter what it is. In games like Lorcana or in the upcoming Cyberpunk, there are only certain cards that can be resourced, and that's not the case in Star Wars Unlimited. In Star Wars Unlimited, it's free for all, go nuts, choose whatever you want. And I think that there are some interesting pros to this system for sure. One of the big things with Star Wars Unlimited as well that I should mention, actually this is relevant, is that the colors of cards in your deck are determined based on your leader and your base. And as a result, there are cards that have like 2 yellow pips that require you to have a yellow leader and a yellow base to be able to play them for their normal cost. But you are allowed to play any card. You just have to pay 2 resources extra for every aspect that is not represented in your base and leader. So like technically speaking, you can play Power of the Dark Side if you are not a villainy blue or blue-black deck, but you're going to pay 5 or 7 even if you don't have the appropriate aspects in your deck, for example. And yeah, so when we're talking about the Star Wars Unlimited resource system, I think there are a couple of aspects at play. One, it's nice because you, again, get to mitigate this resource variance. It does still feel decision intensive though, because with the Star Wars Unlimited system, because you are choosing a card from your hand to go face down to the resource row, generally speaking, you are losing the access to that card long term. And so resourcing correctly and evaluating which cards you're not going to need in this game or which cards you're not going to need in the next couple of turns is a real skill, and there is a lot of room for skill expression in resourcing in a way that is somewhat reminiscent of mana-based construction from Magic, for example. So that's one of the big positives, is that I think that in Star Wars Unlimited, at least, you get to preserve some of those elements of there being decisions around your resources while still removing some of the negative variance around those resourcing decisions. The other positive, I think, around the Star Wars Unlimited resourcing system is, again, that it allows this level of consistency so that you can build your decks in a way where you know you're going to have access to a reasonable play on most turns. And this is for 2 reasons. One, you're basically always hitting your resource, so you're gonna be able to go up the curve. But then also, because you draw 2 cards a turn and not 1 card a turn, the odds that you kind of like quote unquote top deck something live are very high, which to me feels better. Drawing cards is like for the start of your turn is like maybe the most exciting part of a card game turn from my perspective. And so getting to do 2 of those is pretty cool. There are some negative gameplay experiences related to drawing 2 cards a turn. Certainly it can feel as though if you are like behind on resources, or you are behind and your aggro opponent just gets to draw 2 cards every turn, it can feel a little frustrating, but the game is theoretically balanced around this drawing 2 cards a turn, so it's not so bad. So yeah, the Star Wars Unlimited resource system, pretty interesting. Drawing 2 cards a turn, something that I really like. The negatives of the Star Wars Unlimited resource system. And the one other positive is because the system doesn't just say you are hard locked to exactly the colors of your leader, or you are hard locked to some subset of colors that you choose. There are still pretty interesting deck building choices. It has occasionally been correct to play off color cards in your main deck or off aspect cards in your sideboard in Star Wars Unlimited's history. And that actually does lead to really interesting considered deck building choices where you have to make the choice about whether or not your deck can afford to pay 4 resources for Spark of Rebellion, for example. That was a decision that players were sometimes making in their yellow villainy decks, for example. They were deciding, is this card powerful enough that I would just pay 4 for it? For example, or there were some decks that cared about having both villainy and heroism cards in the graveyard. Anakin Skywalker is the card that cares about this, and most decks don't get to play both of those types of cards without some kind of aspect penalty, and players had to make real choices about what of those cards you were going to put in your deck, what was worth it to you to play even with the extra aspect tax, and I think that those were all positives as well. So the negatives of the Star Wars Unlimited system. I think one of the big negatives is actually a gameplay one, and this is something that is going to come up when I talk about Lorcana and Cyberpunk as well. It's something that I've noticed and is, I think, a bit frustrating, which is that when you are playing with resources face down in front of you, it does put this kind of like mechanical restriction on how you play the game that does not exist for games where your resources are face up. So, for example, in a game of Star Wars Unlimited, if you want to put your hand down for some reason, you want to look at a couple of things on the board, maybe you want to check what's in your resource row, which is something that you have to do somewhat frequently. You have to check what's in your resource row because there are cards that can be played out of there. If you set your hand down and you set it remotely close to your resources, it can be really easy to mix up which cards are in your hand, which cards are in your resources, both unintentionally and intentionally, which is, I think, a real downside. So you do have this requirement of like, I have a hand marker, like I have a little token that whenever I put my hand down, I put my token on it so that I know I'm kind of denoting this is my hand, it's sitting here. But there are real gameplay issues associated with that. There are also parsability issues with it, especially if you are not someone who likes using printed sleeves, like graphic sleeves. With graphic sleeves, it's typically reasonably feasible to count how many resources your opponent has. But I, for example, don't like graphic sleeves very much. I prefer solid color ones. And if I just have 5 green sleeves, dark green sleeves face down in front of me, I think it can be pretty challenging for my opponents and sometimes even me to sort out how many resources I have ready and available. And this is a pain point that I think it's kind of exigent to gameplay directly. Like, this is not a design choice. It doesn't necessarily impact the way that the game is designed, but it does impact the way that the game is played. And I do think that there is a real significant execution cost to having cards face down as a core component of your gameplay. And that's come up a couple of times in my experience where it's definitely been a bit weird to evaluate how many resources does my opponent have? How many do I have? What is their hand? What are their resources? That kind of thing. The other negative of this system is the same one that I talked about with Gundam and One Piece, but the consistency of drawing 2 cards a turn, the consistency of always hitting your resources can and does lead to tier 0 formats at a higher rate of incidence than you would see in other games. And Star Wars Unlimited has had its fair share of issues with tier 1 or tier 0 formats where 1 to 3 archetypes have represented 60+% of the metagame. They have been pretty proactive in making bans to attempt to curtail these issues, and by and large, I don't think that you can fault FFG for anything that they've done so far from a reactive balance standpoint. Obviously, ideally, they could have like not printed Jango Fett, uh, but that's a different issue. So from here, we can move on into the other ones that are similar. So Lorcana and Cyberpunk feel similar to Star Wars Unlimited to me. Obviously, there are a couple of distinctions. One, there is not the aspect system where you get to potentially pay extra for your cards. You do just have to pick a couple of colors in both of these games. In Cyberpunk, you can have up to 3 colors in your deck. In Lorcana, you can have up to 2. Cyberpunk is doing something kind of comparable to Star Wars Unlimited, where the amount of RAM that your leaders generate dictates what cards you can play in your deck. So you do have this element that I talked about in the Magic system of like, okay, if we have this powerful red card, we can force you to have to be really invested in being a red deck to play it. And I do think that that is a nice wrinkle on this system. That's a positive. But it is still similar. In terms of the actual resource system, both of these games are doing something where you have to resource a specific type of card face down. And this is mostly a balancing knob for designers. You can make it so that if you're worried about a card being too powerful, you can remove some of the flexibility of that card by making it not resourceable. And if a card is not resourceable, you do have to then subsequently as a player start making decisions about how many of those you can really include in your deck before you're going to start to realize that cost of having a bunch of cards that can't be played as resources. I think that that's a good design knob to have. It does reintroduce some amount of the negative resource variance that theoretically this system of every card in your hand is a resource can ostensibly curtail. So it's like it's a plus and minus, right? Like to an extent you're getting the benefits, and then to an extent you're you're losing some of the positives. I think that both for Lorcana and for Cyberpunk, the positives are pretty comparable to Star Wars Unlimited. Consistency is nice. The fact that you're getting to put cards face down means that you still have to make decisions about which cards to resource, which I think is interesting. But from a negative standpoint, they both still have the same negative in my mind of there's a real gameplay issue of having face down cards being a core part of the gameplay loop. Like there are fair play and just like battlefield parsability issues associated with that I think can come up. And I think that also you are reintroducing some of the potential negative variants. Okay, so next, let's talk about Flesh and Blood. Flesh and Blood has a pretty interesting resource system, quite unique, actually, where most of these other systems I've been talking about very clearly have their bones in, or clearly have their roots in something else. You can kind of see the bones of other resource systems. The Flesh and Blood resource system is relatively different. So, on a Flesh and Blood turn, you get 1 action point. This is basically allows you to play a card, an attack, or what have you, activate an ability from one of your equipment, something like this. And then there is a keyword called Go Again. And if your card has Go Again, you refresh your action point and you go again. It's a well templated keyword, honestly. It pretty clearly communicates what it does. And then the cost of cards is in the top right corner, I believe. And in order to pay for cards, you have to pitch other cards from your hand. So typically most players, you start with 4 cards. So if you play an action that costs 2, you have to pitch 2 resources worth of cards from your hand. Cards can pitch for up to 3. That's the most that they can pitch for. And so you end up in this balance of working out which cards to pitch to play. But in the Flesh and Blood context, a lot of the action is pretty sharp. It happens in a pretty quick period of time. And then when your turn ends, you draw back up to typically 4 cards. Now, Additionally, if you're defending, if you're the defending player, you oftentimes have to use cards to defend. So you're not always starting with 4 cards because you've typically like defended an attack. So you're maybe starting with 2 or 3 cards some amount of the time. But this effect of one action with go again, and then you have to pitch other cards to pay for it, uh, I kind of think starts to capture some of the free form elements of Yu-Gi-Oh that are really desirable and interesting, where you really do have a lot of room for expression in your both your deck building and in your gameplay. And it's certainly, I think, the reason why people find Flesh and Blood so interesting is because the decision trees seem like they should be pretty straightforward. You only get one action. How many decision trees could there really be? But because of Go Again, and because of the kind of relatively judicious use of Go Again, it is a keyword that appears on a lot of cards. And because there is this constant dance of what do I pitch, what do I play, what do I save to potentially be used defensively on my opponent's turn, I think that there are so many moving pieces that it leads to Flesh and Blood having a really interesting and dynamic feeling resource system. I think that from the positive standpoint, it is exceptionally unique. Certainly, of the modern trading card games, I think the Flesh and Blood is the one that has one of the most unique feeling resource systems. Again, on the positive side, this captures a lot of the never really fully like mana screwed or mana flooded elements of Magic, wherein you know, you always theoretically have some resources on your turn. Cards can pitch for very little, so I think you can still end up in a spot where you can't pay costs for certain things, but you're theoretically getting out of the way of some of those issues. So there's that positive as well. On the negative side, I think that this is among the more complicated resource systems to get to an intermediate understanding of. I think it's pretty easy to explain. You make an attack, you pitch to pay for it, and if it has go again, you get to go again. I think that's quite simple. You can get a person to doing level 1 of what happens on a Flesh and Blood turn quite quickly. But I don't think that there should be an expectation that getting to mastery is fast. In fact, that would be a bad thing, I think. You don't want games to be too fast to master, then they wouldn't be interesting. But I do think that with Flesh and Blood, the gap from I play my card and I do what it says on the text box, and if it says go again, I go again. The gap from just understanding how that works to kind of being able to like really play a game where you're making informed choices on your turn. I think that gap is actually like quite large. And as a result, I think that there are some pain points with teaching in that regard. The other thing that I would say is a potential pain point is the go again keyword is pretty sharp when you have a resource that you only have one of, right? It's like basically a binary. You either have an action or you don't. Any card that gets go again stapled to it immediately is doubling theoretically the amount of of this resource that you have access to, and as a result I think that can result in some pretty sharp gameplay around that card. It is obviously a very powerful balancing mechanic, or a very powerful kind of like lever for them to pull on to adjust the power of cards. But it is, at the end of the day, not a lever with a lot of flexibility. It's on or off. Either it has go again or it doesn't have go again. I'm actively looking to learn more Flesh and Blood, by the way, so I'm very excited to play more. But yeah, please let me know in the comments if that evaluation is right, by the way, because that's just that's more of a vibes based thing on my side, that the go again keyword seems like it's a sharp one. So let me know if I'm wrong on that. But that's Flesh and Blood. I want to close by talking about some of the more modern trading card games that are really rooting themselves in existing systems, because we've kind of meandered so far from the big three, and then we've talked about, okay, trying to solve some of the problems, to now with Flesh and Blood, something that's like quite unique. And now I'm going to go back, I think, before we end the video, to a couple of systems that are far more rooted in the kind of like original systems. So the first one that I think that is important to talk about here is Riftbound. This is obviously Riot's new TCG, one that I've been playing a decent amount of. So the resource system in Riftbound is the rune deck. You get to have a deck of 12 runes, and on your turn, you flip up 2. If you are the going second player, you get a third one on your first turn. That is their balancing mechanic for trying to resolve the delta between going first and going second. And cards have 2 different types of costs on them. They cost energy, and they can also cost power. And energy is the just generic number on the card, and then power is the color. And unlike other games where typically once you have a resource, you have it and it doesn't go away, what Riftbound is doing differently is that power costs require you to recycle runes back into your deck. And so essentially what this means is that cards with high color requirements, high power costs, are quite restrictive. You typically can't play more than one of them. Like on back-to-back turns, you're not going to play a double ruined card because you will just have no resources to play anything else. And so what this resource system is trying to do is it's trying to give designers multiple levers to turn. Number one, you're balancing cards based on their energy cost. You can always, go up and down. This is pretty classic Magic, many of the other games we've talked about. And then additionally, the power cost is intended, I think, as a way to, one, push you into potentially needing to be more dedicated to one color over another, but two, restrict the frequency with which you get to access these powerful effects. So let's look at a good example in the game that I think is kind of signifies this pretty clearly. If you look at a card like Sabotage, this is 1 energy and then 1 orange power. You have to recycle an orange rune. And this card is basically like Duress, like you look at your opponent's hand and you put a card on the bottom. This card, if you got to play it over and over again in a game where you got 2 resources every turn for 1 cost, just taking a card out of your opponent's hand, would feel oppressive. It would be very frustrating. But because it also has this energy requirement that requires you to go down a resource long term, it's not something that you can just kind of spew off turn 1 like you would in Magic, for example, with hand attack or in other games. Instead, it requires you to kind of like look for a spot where it's going to clear a path probably for you, and then you subsequently follow up on it, typically on the same turn. And I think that kind of design space is pretty interesting and pretty cool. Additionally, we can see it in some of the more expensive cards in the game, like Time Warp, for example, which is 10 energy and 4 blue power. This is a card that is not intended to be very splashable. They want you to be pretty dedicated to be playing blue runes in order to be playing this card. And and that makes sense. And it also means that although you get to take an extra turn with this card, super splashy, powerful effect, on that turn, you're going to have deramped yourself by 4. You're going to have a lot fewer resources on that subsequent follow-up turn, which I think is another kind of interesting balancing mechanic. It is allowing players to access effects consistently, but it's trying to gate the number of turns in a row that you can kind of like swing for the fences and play these super splashy, powerful effects. So what are the pros of the Riftbound system? It resolves a bunch of the resource variants, which I think is, again, another positive. We're talking about it in basically all of these systems. They're trying to resolve resource variants. I think that one of the big things about the Riftbound system too is that it's very cool, is that it preserves that feeling of needing to make choices around how you construct your resource deck, much like Force of Will, like we started with. You actually have to make choices about like, Are you going to play 4 orange, 8 red? Like what's your split going to look like in order to be able to support all of the power costs in your deck? Which I think is very cool and very interesting. Um, on the negative side, there are a couple of things with this system that I think are pain points. Number one, talking about it is actually incredibly complicated. And not complicated, but it's confusing. Energy and power are two words that are synonyms. They mean the same thing. And so in some ways, they might as well mean nothing. And so when I was starting to learn the game, and you would be like talking with someone about a card, you'd be like, oh yeah, the 2 energy card or the 2 power card. And someone would be like, do you mean energy? And I would be like, yes, I guess. And cards often refer to making energy or making power. And I think that that's a real pain point and is something that they missed out on. In fact, I think that in general, a decent amount of the templating in Riftbound leaves a little bit to be desired. And this is, I think, a good example of why I feel that. There are just some pain points where I think that talking about the game is harder than it should be. It reads okay a lot of the time because on text boxes, power is signified by a little icon. It's not written as power. But when you're talking about it, it is, I think, a little bit overwhelming at times. The other negative behind this system, in my opinion, is that when they have missed on the power costs, specifically of cards, that's when it has felt the most oppressive. So like a good example of this is like one of the cards that got banned in their first passive bans was Fight or Flight. This was a card that allowed you to move a unit from a battlefield back to base, yours or your opponent's. And this was an effect that they just fundamentally missed on. And the fact that it had no power cost associated with it was one of the main reasons why it just felt so oppressive. And I think that the way that the system is designed is, again, very sharp. Missing on the amount of power is going to feel really bad, especially the amount of power between 0 and 1. Cards that have no power cost associated with them have this onus to just not be that powerful necessarily. And I worry about that from a design standpoint long term. Lastly, I think that the only other issue that I see with the this resource system is that there are other kind of parsability issues with it on the battlefield that I think are a little bit weird. You can, for example, use a rune for its power, recycle it into the deck, but float the energy from it. So like basically tap it, float the energy from it, recycle it into your deck. And that has caused like a decent amount of confusion already. People were doing things like turning them upside down to indicate that they had been recycled, but that there was still an energy pending to be used from it. Riot had to step in and say you can't do that because it was leading to people either not recycling the runes properly or not recycling runes in the correct order. And there are just like some weird moving parts around this that have not been fully resolved. And I think that as the game matures a little bit, you'll probably see players find better ways to track these things, and then it won't be necessarily as big of an issue. But overall, those are kind of like the main pain points that I would identify with this system. And then I think the last one with this system that I think is a little bit strange is, again, and this has come up for me a lot, but the consistency of 2 resources every turn does mean that like you end up in these spots where it can feel exceptionally challenging to come back because your opponent just has so many resources and the games are as a result happening like a lot faster. I think that can be a positive and a negative. Like the fact that you're playing 6 drops on turn 3, probably for some people is a good thing. That's probably just something that they actively want. For me, I think that it sometimes involves games becoming too splashy too quickly, and a little bit too battle cruisery. But I think your mileage may vary on that, whether or not you like that system or you don't like that system. Okay, we're in the home stretch where I'm going to reveal my favorite resource system very soon. But I wanted to talk about one last game. I've had at least one person in my comments asking me about this game for a while, so I figured it would be good to bring it up. This game, I think, has a pretty interesting resource system. I have not played yet, but I have done a bunch of reading on the how to play, everything like that. And this is Elestrals. So Elestrals is made by a former Pokemon content creator, and you can tell. So the Elestrals resource system is basically marrying elements of Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh together. So in the Elestral system, you have a deck of what are called spirits. I'm gonna look at my notes to make sure I don't get this wrong because I don't want to be wrong. Yeah, so spirits. And importantly about spirits is that this is a deck of 20 cards that you are allowed to look at any time, and you aren't drawing from this deck. You are just selecting cards from this deck to use. However, the interesting thing and the kind of like wrinkle about this is that spirits are also your life points. If you run out of spirits, you lose the game. So, what this creates is this interesting dynamic where on your turn, you're using spirits to play Elestrals uh, well, what's the term? It's not evolve, but it feels like evolve, hence why it has some definite Pokemon vibes to it. Um, you're ascending Elestrals using spirits, or you can attach spirits to an Elestral to um, allow them to use their attacks. Again, very Pokemon coded. Uh, and so as a result, what you've got is a system that kind of marries Yu-Gi-Oh and Pokemon. You are spending one spirit per turn, and you can think about this one spirit per turn a bit like a normal summon, I think, because you basically spend the spirit to like normal an Elestral or ascend an Elestral or enchant an Elestral, attach the spirit to it directly. Or you can use it to draw a card, which is a nice stopgap, I think, to allow you to never fully feel dead. And then outside of these actions that are specifically gated to spirit usage, you have a bunch of other cards that you can use in runes. These, I think, would be comparable to spells or items or supporters in the Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh contexts. And I think that as a result, you end up uh, with a system that is pretty interesting. You're getting a lot of the benefits of the freeform feel of Yu-Gi-Oh! I think that currently, like, there are obviously ways to special cast Elestrals that you can get into play. Um, but it doesn't seem like it's quite the same as Yu-Gi-Oh! In terms of the number of them that you can that you can put into play on a particular turn. And the fact that your spirits are directly associated with your life total means that making decisions about which Elestrals you're going to play and which Elestrals you're going to ascend and enchant, you can't just spew that off. And in most games, it's typically correct to just spend your resources every turn as long as you can. And in Elestrals, it's one of the first games that I've really encountered where that's potentially not true, which I think is pretty interesting and a pretty cool innovation in the space. Um, Similarly, I think that there's all those positives. It's very novel. It's taking a lot of the elements from games that have typically been pretty hard to borrow elements from, and using them in a way that definitely does feel new in a bunch of ways. I think that there are some pain points with this system. One, much like I talked about with Pokemon, the punishment that you feel for spending your energy wrong cascades in a way that you don't feel it from other resource systems. And I think that that would be the same here. If you enchant an Elestral or choose to summon the wrong, to cast the wrong Elestral with your once per turn spirit, I think that that can potentially snowball and feel quite negative would be my guess. I don't know enough about the construction of Elestral stacks to know where they stand on the consistency standpoint between, like, say, like Pokemon or Magic. Pokemon, where you're like typically accessing things at a pretty high rate of consistency. Magic, you're typically not. You have a much more varied experience game to game. But that being said, it still seems like you could run into issues certainly where if you enchant the wrong Elestral or you play the wrong Elestral, you're going to feel that impact for the rest of the game, potentially. Which is, I think, a pain point that seems pretty real to me. But who knows? Maybe it's not so bad. Um, but yeah, I just wanted to talk about this one. Again, I don't like spending a lot of time talking about games that I haven't played. Like, I'm not going to offer a ton of negative criticism about this, but I do think that the system looks very cool and very interesting. And I wanted to shout it out in part because there's at least one commenter who I think has brought it up 2 or 3 times. So I figured I would be remiss if I didn't at least check it out enough to be able to talk about it in the resource system video. So to close, what is my favorite resource system? I went to start talking and I started coughing. I am still a little bit sick. I'm sorry. What an anticlimactic way to get into this. So I'm going to talk about two. I'm going to talk about my favorite modern resource system, and then I'm also going to talk about my favorite historical resource system. I want to be very clear though, even though the title says which one's the best, this was mostly a way to get people in the door to talk about all of the resource systems that I've been kind of engaging with recently and the ones and what I think are interesting about them, what are the pros and cons, what it kind of allows you to do in your game. Okay, so let's start with my favorite historical resource system. Of the three kind of like OG trading card games, my favorite system is going to be the Magic Mana system. For all of its foibles, for all of the times that I've drawn 10 lands in a row, for all of the times that I've drawn 10 spells in a row, the decision trees around how you build your mana base, the decision trees about how you manage your mana in a game to game basis are just so interesting and really do create very cool deck building constraints. They create very cool deck building experiences. And there's just, for me, nothing quite like getting to make those decisions and getting to engage with those decisions. So that is my favorite system historically. That being said, I think that this is the one that is in some ways the most disliked by people. And I totally understand if for you the negatives outweigh the positives. I get it. I'm fully on board and I do understand why why you would feel that way. Of the modern systems, kind of games made in the last 5-ish years, I think my favorite system that I have played with is actually the Star Wars Unlimited system. I think that it does a nice job of marrying the consistency that you get from being able to resource any card, or yeah, well, you get any card in Star Wars Unlimited, but similar to Lorcana. But it also has deck building choices around the bases that you choose, the leaders that you choose. And I really like that despite the fact that the cards that are going into your deck, they're typically informed by what your leader and base are. I think the fact that you still have the chance to kind of break those rules and include cards that you are just accepting you're going to pay a higher cost for them, but you feel the effect is valuable enough in your deck you need to play it. I think that that is a really nice thing to have baked into the system, which I really enjoy. And then lastly, this one is just like, I don't know, it's probably just the monkey brain in me that I really like drawing cards. It's just, I see cards, I'm happy. So drawing 2 cards a turn is just good for me, and I really enjoy it. So Star Wars Unlimited is my favorite modern system. Magic the Gathering is my favorite kind of OG system. That being said, I would love to hear what your favorite system is and why you like it in the comments below. So please let me know. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, I really hope that you will subscribe. I've also created a Patreon. I've been really enjoying creating this content, and if you want to support me making more of this content, you can do so there. It's got a pretty lean set of perks currently. I'm still shaking out exactly what it's going to be, but the couple of ones that I have for sure are a feed where you're going to be able to vote on upcoming videos, give input, have a kind of more direct line of feedback for me about certain things. And then also, obviously, I'm going to be thanking people in the end credits of videos as well. So I really appreciate it if you would check that out as well. And without further ado, I will see you in the next one.